How far do you have to walk into the woods before the woods decide you belong to them? Because there's a number. There's a distance. Some invisible threshold where the trail behind you stops mattering, and the trees close like a door you didn't know you walked through. And the people I'm going to tell you about tonight, some of them didn't even walk that far. One of them was 74 years old, a man who had spent more time in the wilderness than most people spend indoors, a hunting guide, the kind of man other men hired to keep them safe in the backcountry. He walked ahead of his group by maybe 100 yards. He told his son-in-law he'd only be going a short distance. He was never seen again. 300 people searched for him. Soldiers were deployed. Dogs combed through hollows and ridgelines. And after over a week, all they found was a single rifle cartridge sitting in a creek. That was 1945. And to this day, nobody knows if that cartridge even belonged to him. But what makes that story terrifying isn't the disappearance itself. It's who he was. Because this wasn't a lost tourist in flip-flops. This was the guide, the expert, the man who knew those woods better than anyone alive. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 4 stories. All adults, all lesser known. All people who walked into forests and never walked back out, under circumstances that range from deeply strange to genuinely inexplicable. And the 3rd story, it involves a park ranger, the only National Park Service ranger in modern history to go missing from his post and never be found. And what happened after he vanished might be worse than the disappearance itself. Lock the door, kill the lights, and if you hear a sound outside your window while I'm talking, just stay where you are. Before we get into it, 2 things. First, every person in this script is an adult. Second, these stories are built from publicly available records, news reports, search and rescue documents, missing persons databases, and family accounts. Some of these cases are still officially open, so when I speculate, I'll tell you. When something is confirmed fact, I'll tell you that too. Alright. Story 1, The Guide, Mitty Rivers. The Green Mountains of southwestern Vermont are beautiful in the way that makes you forget they can kill you. In the fall, the leaves burn red and gold. The air smells like cold water and decaying wood. Trails wind through forests so dense that sunlight only touches the ground in narrow columns, like spotlights in an empty theater. But beneath the postcard beauty, this part of Vermont, the area around Glastonbury Mountain, has a reputation. The Abenaki people who lived in this region long before European settlement considered parts of these mountains cursed. According to their traditions, Glastonbury was a place to bury the dead, not a place to live, not a place to linger. And starting in 1945, a series of disappearances would make the Abenaki's unease feel like prophecy. The first person to vanish was a man named Mitty Rivers. Mitty was 74 years old. And if you're picturing a frail old man leaning on a cane, you've got the wrong picture entirely. Mitty Rivers was a lifelong outdoorsman, a hunter, a fisherman, and a guide. He'd spent decades walking these exact woods. He knew every hollow, every ridge, every creek crossing. Friends described him as someone who could navigate the backcountry the way most people navigate their own living room. So when Mitty agreed to lead a hunting party into the mountains on November 12th, 1945, nobody was worried. This was what he did. This was who he was. The group consisted of Mitty, his son-in-law Joe, and 4 other hunters. They were based out of a camp in Bickford Hollow, a remote area about 4 miles west of the town of Bennington, nestled near the Long Trail and Vermont Route 9. On the morning of the 12th, Mitty and Joe set out together from camp. They walked the familiar terrain, moving through timber and along creek beds, and at some point, they reached a fork, a place where the trail split. And this is where the story breaks. Mitty told Joe he was going to keep going, just a short distance. He said he'd circle back and meet the group for lunch. Only be going a short distance. Those, as far as anyone knows, were the last words Mitty Rivers ever spoke to another human being. He walked ahead, and he disappeared. At first, nobody panicked, because why would they? This was Mitty Rivers. If anyone could handle themselves in these woods, it was him. The group assumed he'd gotten caught up tracking something, or decided to check on a spot he knew. Experienced hunters do that. They follow instinct. They trust their own sense of direction more than a map. But when the afternoon wore on and Mitty hadn't returned to camp, concern began to settle in. By the next day, the situation had escalated. Local authorities were called, volunteers mobilized, and then the search grew into something the area hadn't seen in years. Over the course of more than a week, approximately 300 people searched for Mitty Rivers. That wasn't a typo. 300. Among them were soldiers from Fort Devens in Massachusetts and members of the Vermont State Guard. They brought dogs. They combed through the hollows and drainages. They pushed through underbrush so thick it could hide a man standing upright at 10 feet. And after all of that, after 8 days of organized, relentless effort, they found exactly one thing: a single rifle cartridge, sitting in a creek. The cartridge was the same type that Mitty used. The theory was that he'd bent down, maybe to cross the water, maybe to pick something up, and the cartridge had fallen from his pocket. But there was no way to definitively prove it was his. And more importantly, there was no Mitty. No body, no clothing, no pack, no blood, no signs of a struggle or an animal attack. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles into a forest when the forest has decided it's done talking. Here's what makes this case sit in your chest like a stone. Mitty Rivers was the guide. He was the safety net. He was the man you called when the woods felt too big. If he had been some weekend hiker who wandered off a marked trail, the disappearance would still be sad, but it would make a kind of sense. People get lost. Terrain is unforgiving. Mistakes happen. But Mitty didn't make mistakes. Not in these woods. And he didn't just walk into an unfamiliar landscape. He walked into his own backyard. The distance between where he separated from his son-in-law and where they expected him to return was short. By all accounts, it was a minor detour, a quick loop, the kind of thing he'd done 1,000 times. And yet, it was enough. Let's talk about what could have happened. Not the conspiracy theories, not the paranormal speculation, just the real physical possibilities that investigators and wilderness experts typically consider. A medical event is the most commonly cited explanation. At 74, even a fit man is vulnerable. A heart attack, a stroke, a sudden collapse. If Mitty went down in a low spot, behind a ridge, in heavy brush, near the edge of a creek bank, it's possible his body was concealed by the terrain itself. Vermont's forests are layered with deadfall, thick ferns, and mossy ground cover that can hide a human body disturbingly well. An accidental fall is another possibility. Creek beds in this area are rocky and uneven. A slip on wet stone, a tumble into a ravine. If it happened in the right place, even a large search team could walk within yards of the location and never see him. And then there's the harder question, the one nobody wants to ask. Could someone have been out there? In 1945, the area around Glastonbury was remote. Deeply, genuinely remote. The towns of Glastonbury and Somerset were already well on their way to becoming ghost towns, unincorporated by the state legislature in 1937. People avoided the area. The woods were effectively lawless. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And without a body, without evidence, without a single definitive clue beyond a cartridge in a creek, you're left guessing. And the guessing never stops. After Mitty's disappearance, many locals held out hope. They told themselves that a man like him, tough, experienced, resourceful, would find his way back. He'd show up in town one day, a little thinner, a little irritated, with a story about getting turned around. He never did, and within 5 years of his vanishing, 4 more people would disappear in the same stretch of Vermont wilderness. A college student, a veteran, a young boy, and a seasoned hiker. The area would eventually be given a name, the Bennington Triangle. But Mitty Rivers was the first, the one that opened the door, and that door has never closed. Now, if story 1 is about a man the woods shouldn't have been able to take, story 2 is about a woman the woods shouldn't have been able to hide. Story 2, Over the Hill, Thelma Polly Melton. The Great Smoky Mountains have a way of making you feel small, not in a bad way, at first. The ridges roll out in every direction like frozen green waves. The mist sits in the valleys like breath on a cold morning. And the trails, hundreds of miles of them, wind through some of the most visited wilderness in the country. But here's the thing about the Smokies that tourists tend to forget. The park covers over 500,000 acres. And the moment you step off the maintained trail system, the landscape becomes dense, tangled, and dangerously disorienting. The undergrowth is thick enough to stop you in your tracks. The terrain folds in on itself, ridges hiding hollows, hiding creek beds, hiding more ridges. People disappear here, more often than you'd think. On September 25th, 1981, a woman named Thelma Pauline Melton, Polly to everyone who knew her, went for a walk on a trail she had hiked dozens of times. She was 58 years old. She lived part of the year in Jacksonville, Florida, and spent each fall camping in the Smokies with her husband, Bob. They owned an Airstream trailer parked at the Deep Creek campground on the North Carolina side of the park. Polly loved these mountains. She loved this trail. She loved the routine of it, the familiar curves, the sound of the creek running alongside the gravel path, the way the afternoon light filtered through the canopy. On this particular afternoon, Polly set out with two female friends, women she'd known for years. The plan was simple: walk the Deep Creek Trail, enjoy the air, get some exercise, and be back at camp in time for dinner. Polly had already prepared sauce for the spaghetti she planned to cook that evening. Let that detail sit for a second. She made spaghetti sauce. She took a short nap. Then she went for a walk. This was not a woman planning to disappear. The three women set out around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Deep Creek Trail is considered easy by park standards. It's a well-maintained gravel path that runs parallel to the creek. Families walk it. Tourists walk it. It's not a wilderness bushwhack. It's a pleasant afternoon stroll. At first, Polly was walking slower than usual. Her friends teased her about it. Light, friendly ribbing, the kind of thing old friends do. One of them reportedly called out something like, "I wouldn't want to be in a foot race with you, Polly." Polly laughed, and then, according to her companions, something shifted. Polly started walking faster, not running, but noticeably picking up her pace. Moving with purpose, pulling ahead of her two friends. They watched her walk up a rise in the trail. She crested a small hill. Just before she disappeared over the top, she turned and waved, and then she was gone, over the hill, out of sight. When her friends came down the other side, maybe 30 seconds later, they expected to see Polly sitting on one of the trailside benches, catching her breath. The bench was empty. The trail was empty. Polly was gone. Like she ceased to exist. When the two women reached camp, roughly half an hour after losing sight of Polly, they assumed she'd simply beaten them back. She was faster. She knew the way. It made sense. But Polly's husband Bob was inside the Airstream. He hadn't seen her. Now the math stopped working. Polly hadn't gone back to camp. She hadn't continued down the trail. The path led to areas her friends would have seen her. She hadn't called out, hadn't signaled, hadn't left any indication of where she'd gone. She had walked over a hill on a gravel trail, in broad daylight, in a populated park, and vanished. By 6 o'clock that evening, a park ranger was notified. By the following morning, the search was growing. And then something happened that made the hair stand up on every searcher's neck. They brought in bloodhounds. The dogs were taken to the spot on the trail where Polly's friends had last seen her, the crest of that small hill. The dogs picked up the scent. They followed it. And then they stopped. According to reports, the bloodhounds began circling at the location where the scent ended. They howled. They whimpered, as though Polly had simply stopped being there. The dogs and the search teams came to the same unsettling conclusion. Wherever Polly went after she crested that hill, she likely was no longer in the immediate area. Alive or dead, she was somewhere else. When investigators pieced together what Polly was carrying when she disappeared, the picture got stranger. She had no money, no identification, no medications, and she took prescriptions for high blood pressure and nausea. She didn't have car keys because she'd been barred from driving that month. Her husband had the keys to the Airstream. The only things she was carrying, as far as anyone could determine, were her cigarettes. Polly was a heavy smoker, reportedly 2 packs of Virginia Slims a day. That's it. A woman with cigarettes, and nothing else, walked off a trail in the Great Smoky Mountains and was never heard from again. In the weeks and months that followed, investigators dug into Polly's life looking for anything that might explain the disappearance. They found small things, not big things, not obvious things, just wrinkles. Polly's mother had died earlier that year, and she had been grieving. Her minister told investigators she'd experienced minor bouts of depression. She'd used Valium frequently in 1979, though by 1981 she was believed to have stopped. After her disappearance, however, Bob noticed that his own Valium prescription was missing. Whether Polly had taken it was unknown. There was also this. Polly normally volunteered at a center where she served meals to senior citizens. She went almost every day, but on September 25th, the day she disappeared, she decided not to go. No clear reason was ever given. And the day before her disappearance, she reportedly placed a phone call from the center, unusual for her, to an unknown person. These details don't prove anything. They could mean everything, or they could mean nothing. But they hang in the air. There are broadly 3 lanes of possibility here. The first is a medical event. Polly had health issues. If she experienced a cardiac episode, a stroke, or a fall after cresting that hill, and if she stumbled off the trail even a short distance into the dense undergrowth, it's possible she collapsed in a spot that searchers couldn't reach visually. The Smokies are notorious for concealing people even short distances from maintained paths. But the dogs didn't find a scent trail leading off the path. They circled and howled at the spot where the trail went cold. That's unusual for a medical event scenario where you'd expect the scent to continue at least some distance. The second is voluntary disappearance. Could Polly have planned this? Could she have walked ahead, met someone and left her life behind? It's hard to square with the spaghetti sauce, the nap, the lack of money, the lack of ID, and the fact that her family described her as someone who would never leave without warning. But investigators have to consider it. The third is foul play. A crowded trail in a national park might sound like the last place someone could be harmed. But the trail wasn't crowded that afternoon. And the window between Polly cresting the hill and her friends arriving at the same spot was maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds is long enough. That's the sickening truth. And in those 30 seconds, the world lost Polly Melton. Decades later, Polly's case remains open. Researchers and authors have dug into it. Books have been written. Theories have been proposed and debated and discarded. But no one has ever answered the central question. How does a woman wave goodbye, walk over a hill on a busy trail, and cease to exist? The bloodhounds couldn't explain it. The searchers couldn't explain it. The investigators couldn't explain it. And the Great Smoky Mountains, as always, kept their mouth shut. If Story 2 is about a woman who vanished in 30 seconds, Story 3 is about a man who vanished from the place that was supposed to protect him, his workplace. Story 3, The Ranger, Paul Fugate. Chiricahua National Monument sits in the far southeastern corner of Arizona, near the Mexican border. It's the kind of landscape that looks like it was designed by someone trying to build a maze out of stone. Towering rock spires, deep canyons, narrow arroyos, and a labyrinth of trails that wind through terrain so rugged it earned the nickname, the Wonderland of Rocks. But beneath the beauty, this place has always carried an edge. The Chiricahua Apache held this land as a stronghold. The area was the site of some of the last armed conflicts between indigenous people and the U.S. government. The faraway ranch, now part of the monument, preserves the history of that frontier. And in 1980, the monument was not the well-staffed, well-patrolled park it would later become. It was isolated, remote, and dangerously close to smuggling corridors that ran across the Mexican border. On January 13, 1980, a 41-year-old park ranger named Paul Braxton Fugate walked out of the monument's visitor center, told a seasonal employee he'd be back in a couple of hours, and disappeared from the face of the earth. He is, to this day, the only National Park Service ranger in modern American history to go missing and never be found. Paul Fugate was a naturalist. He loved the outdoors with a depth that went beyond profession into identity. He'd spent years working for the Park Service, answering visitors' questions, curating exhibits, assembling trail guides and plant lists. He lived on site during his rotations in a basic cobblestone cabin. The work was solitary, especially during the off-season, but Paul seemed to thrive in the quiet. He was also, by multiple accounts, a nonconformist. Earlier in his career, he'd been fired by the Park Service for having long hair and a handlebar mustache. violations of the NPS's conservative grooming standards at the time. He fought the firing, won his job back, and returned to his post. He was married to a woman named Dodie, a scientific photographer at the University of Arizona. Dodie visited occasionally, but generally stayed in Tucson while Paul lived at the monument during his duty rotations. On that January day, it was the off-season. Paul was the only permanent staff member on duty. The only other person present was a seasonal clerk. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Paul told the clerk he was going to check the nature trail toward the faraway ranch area, a 400-acre section of land the monument had recently acquired. He said if he wasn't back by 4:30, to go ahead and close up without him. He left his radio behind. He didn't take anything unusual, just his keys, his NPS uniform, his Red Wing boots, and a green down parka, and then he walked out the door. When Paul didn't return, the alarm went up. Park staff contacted authorities. A search was initiated, and the search found nothing, or rather, it found almost nothing. The monument covers about 12,000 acres of incredibly complex terrain. Canyons, arroyos, barrancas, hundreds of places where a person could be concealed by stone and brush. Search teams covered as much ground as possible, using dogs, helicopters, and volunteers. But the landscape was working against them. This wasn't a meadow. This was a three-dimensional maze. And then something surfaced that shifted the entire investigation. Some park employees reported seeing vehicle spin-out tracks on a primitive road near the faraway ranch area. There were also what appeared to be signs of a struggle in the dirt. And one employee told investigators something that, if true, changes the entire story. He said he saw Paul Fugate at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of his disappearance, seated in a pickup truck that was traveling away from the monument at high speed. Paul was reportedly slumped between two men. When police placed this witness under hypnosis to improve his recall, he described Paul as looking sad and dejected. He described one of the men as wearing a green jacket. The other wore a red, black and white plaid shirt, had a beard, and appeared to be in his 30s. No pickup truck was ever identified. No men were ever found. And this is where the story takes a turn that might make you angrier than the disappearance itself. In February of 1981, roughly 1 year after Paul vanished, the National Park Service did not intensify the investigation. Instead, they fired him. The NPS formally terminated Paul Fugate for abandoning his position. Their regional chief detective told a reporter he believed Paul was living with a paramour somewhere, very healthy, and that finding him was not a priority. They demanded that Dodie, Paul's wife, return nearly $7,000 in partial salary payments they had made to her during the year he was listed as missing. Let that sink in. A man disappears from a national monument in an area with known drug smuggling activity. A witness reports seeing him being driven away against his will, and the government's response is to fire him and ask his wife for the money back. Dodie fought. She wrote rebuttals. She challenged the NPS at every turn. The case eventually reached the desk of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. It wasn't until 1986, 6 years later, that an NPS investigator and an Arizona Department of Public Safety investigator conducted a thorough review of the case files and concluded there was no evidence that Paul had left voluntarily. Dodie's survivor benefits were finally approved, but Paul was never found. In the early 1980s, Cochise County, the county where Chiricahua sits, shared 80 miles of border with Mexico. The Chiricahua Corridor was a historic immigration route and, increasingly, a drug smuggling pathway. Illegal activity wasn't theoretical in this area, it was constant. Every day, people and substances moved through the desert landscape surrounding the monument. If Paul stumbled across a smuggling operation during his trail check, if he walked into the wrong place at the wrong time, the consequences could have been immediate and permanent. This theory gained even more weight decades later. In 2014, a Park Service employee named Karen Gonzalez was assaulted at the faraway ranch, the same area Paul was heading toward, by an alleged drug smuggler. And over the years, human remains have turned up in the surrounding Coronado National Forest, some under suspicious circumstances. But there were also stranger leads. An anonymous letter sent to investigators mentioned an inmate named Tex Carpenter, who had allegedly told a fellow prisoner that he helped knock off and get rid of a park ranger, in Chiricahua. The letter writer used punctuation and syntax that suggested intimate familiarity with the case. Investigators followed the lead, but hit a wall. Years later, when a journalist visited Dodie at her home in New Mexico, she pointed to something in the room. On the back of a chair hung a wrinkled work shirt and a pair of jeans. They were Paul's civvies, the street clothes he would have changed into after finishing work on the last day he was ever seen. He never came back to put them on. Dodie had kept them, for decades, on the same chair. When asked about it, she said simply, "For a long time I went into another dimension. The NPS now offers a $60,000 reward for information leading to the resolution of Paul Fugate's case. Nobody has ever collected it." Story 4 gives us something the other stories don't. A body, well, a backpack, and a $500,000 question that nobody can answer. Story 4. The Backpack, Michael Fissery. There's a part of Yosemite that most people never see. When you think of Yosemite, you think of Half Dome, El Capitan, Yosemite Valley with its thundering waterfalls and granite walls, millions of visitors a year, bumper-to-bumper traffic on park roads, gift shops, shuttle buses, Instagram posts. But the park is massive, over 750,000 acres. And on the north side, past the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, the landscape opens into a vast, sparsely visited backcountry that feels like a different planet from the tourist zones. It's quiet up there, deeply, profoundly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound intrusive. On June 15, 2005, a 51-year-old man named Michael Allen Fissery drove to the Hetch Hetchy area and started walking. He never came back. Michael Fissery grew up in Southern California. He attended the University of California and was described by people who knew him as highly intelligent, possessing something close to a photographic memory. He worked for the post office. He loved cycling and hiking. But more than anything, Michael was an outdoorsman, not the weekend warrior kind, the kind who measured his life in trail miles. He'd spent over 30 years hiking in wilderness areas. He was physically fit. He was experienced. He knew how to read terrain, follow a map, and make smart decisions in the backcountry. He had 2 sisters, Honor and Robin, who adored him. Michael had obtained a wilderness permit for a multi-day solo hike. His plan was to start at the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, head north toward Rancheria Falls, continue to Till Mountain, loop through Lake Vernon and Beehive, and return the way he came. His permit expired on June 19th. On the morning of June 15th, park officials saw Michael hiking alone near the reservoir. He appeared healthy. He appeared normal. That was the last confirmed sighting. June 19th came and went. Michael's permit expired. His family waited. Then they worried. Then they called. On June 21st, the Park Service launched a search. What followed would become the most expensive search and rescue operation in Yosemite's history, costing approximately $452,000. To put that in perspective, Yosemite accounted for a quarter of all search and rescue spending in the entire national park system that year. Search teams from 5 different county agencies deployed into the backcountry. Helicopters circled overhead, dogs worked the trails, and eventually they found something: Michael's backpack. It was located near Till Mountain, just off a trail, but critically, not on his originally planned route. The backpack was in terrain described as extremely rugged and hazardous. Inside the pack, most of Michael's gear was present, but 3 items were missing: his water bottle, his camera, and his topographical map. If Michael left his backpack deliberately, to take a short side trip, to refill his water, to photograph something interesting, he took the 3 things you'd grab for a quick detour: water, camera, map. But he never came back for the rest. Despite spending nearly $500,000 and deploying an enormous search effort across extremely challenging terrain, no other trace of Michael Fissery was ever found. No clothing, no gear, no remains, no bones, just a backpack, sitting where it shouldn't have been, missing 3 items that suggest a man who planned to return in minutes. Let's consider the possibilities. Michael's backpack was found near a slope that descended toward a river. If he went to refill his water bottle, if his footing gave way on the rocky terrain, if he fell into fast-moving water, the river could have carried him away from the search area, In rugged mountain terrain, river recovery is notoriously difficult. Bodies can be pinned beneath boulders, pulled into underwater debris, or swept miles downstream into narrow canyons where no search team would think to look. There's also the possibility that Michael encountered something unexpected in the backcountry. Remote areas of national parks have historically been used for illegal marijuana cultivation and methamphetamine production. If Michael stumbled across an operation and was perceived as a threat, the consequences could have been swift. But there's no evidence for that, just the terrible absence of evidence for anything at all. And then there's the terrain itself. The Hetch Hetchy backcountry is vast and deeply inhospitable in places. Rock slides, cliff bands, dense timber. A person could fall into a ravine or a crevice and be invisible from 10 feet away. After 20 years of weather, snowmelt, and biological processes, the chances of accidental discovery approach zero. After the official search was suspended, Michael's family refused to stop looking. His sister Honor formed a company called Pack 6, which assembled pre-made survival kits for hikers: compass, knife, headlamp, fire starter, signal mirror, whistle. The name Pack 6 referred to those 6 items. Her mission was born from losing her brother and wanting no other family to experience the same helpless feeling. Honor and Robin returned to the backcountry themselves, sometimes with professional guides, retracing Michael's likely route, searching areas the official teams hadn't reached. They found nothing, and year after year, the Hetch Hetchy backcountry kept its silence. Here's the detail I can't stop thinking about. Michael took his camera. When you take your camera on a short side trip in the backcountry, it means you see something worth photographing, maybe a waterfall, maybe a vista, maybe wildlife. You take your water bottle because you're thirsty. You take your map because you want to check a landmark. You take your camera because something caught your eye. Which means, in all likelihood, the last thing Michael Fisery did before he vanished was see something beautiful. And whatever it was, it pulled him just far enough from his pack, just far enough from safety, that the wilderness closed around him. And 20 years later, neither the forest nor the mountain has given him back. 4 stories. A hunting guide in Vermont who walked 100 yards ahead and was never seen again. A woman in the Smokies who waved, crested a hill, and ceased to exist. A park ranger in Arizona who walked out of his own visitor center into a landscape that may have been more dangerous than anyone realized. And a hiker in Yosemite who set down his backpack, grabbed his camera, and stepped into nothing. If there's a common thread, it isn't a conspiracy. It isn't a monster. It isn't a portal or a curse, despite what the internet loves to imagine. The common thread is simpler and worse. It's that the wilderness does not care about your experience level. It does not care about your preparation. It does not care that you've walked this trail 100 times, that you know these woods like the back of your hand, that you're a guide, a ranger, a veteran of the backcountry. The wilderness is indifferent, and indifference is harder to fight than malice. Because malice has a pattern, malice has a motive, malice can be predicted and avoided. Indifference just waits. It waits for the wrong step, the wrong second, the wrong 30-foot detour off a trail you've walked your whole life, and then it collects you. If you go into the woods, and I hope you do because the woods are extraordinary, do these things. Not because I'm trying to scare you, but because the families of the people I just told you about would give anything to go back and change one small detail. Tell someone exactly where you're going. Not, I'm going hiking. Give them a trail name, a direction, a timeline, carry a whistle, carry a signal mirror, carry something that makes noise or reflects light. Your voice will give out before a whistle will. Bring navigation, a map, a compass, a GPS. Your phone is wonderful until it isn't. And if something feels wrong, if the terrain shifts, if the weather changes, if that quiet voice in your gut says, turn around, listen to it. Because every person in tonight's stories had a moment, a fork in the trail, a decision point, a place where the story could have gone differently. And in every case, the choice they made, or the choice that was made for them, was measured in yards, not miles. Mitty Rivers told his son-in-law he'd only be going a short distance. Polly Melton waved and walked over a hill. Paul Fugate said he'd be back by 4:30. Michael Fisery set down his backpack. None of them thought they were saying goodbye. And the next time you're on a trail, and the trees go quiet, and you get that feeling, that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense that the woods are watching, don't analyze it, don't rationalize it, just turn around. And don't stop until you're back where the silence breaks.